So here's my next project. This is a Kohler 10-horse motor off a Gravely Commercial 10A. I had a problem with this motor with the throttle, and I thought it was a problem with the throttle linkage, but it turns out it was actually the governor. Let me show you what happened. This is what's called the governor cross shaft, which is broken off right here. This is what it should look like. Should have this whole arm on there, which on the original one it broke right off, I guess. This is the governor gear that came out of this engine, which is missing all of the internal parts, which none of this stuff was in the oil pan when I took it apart. So at some point in time somebody else must have rebuilt this motor and dissected those parts. This is a used governor gear. You see it should have all these flyweights in there. I have a brand new gear to put in there. So what I've done is I had to take the whole motor apart. The crankshaft came out, the camshaft, the piston, the rod, everything. I've just taken it apart. I've honed out the cylinder a little bit with a little drill hone. I've measured the cylinder, and when I took it apart there was a 20 over piston in this engine, and I've measured the piston and I measured the cylinder, and we're within Kohler specs for the clearance, so I'm not going to go to a 30 over. So what I've done is I've bought let's see here, this is a new piston. I need to gap the rings and get this thing installed. Let's see, this is my crankshaft, which I sent out to be machined. When I took out the crank, a little history, this engine had blown a rod a few years ago, and I just slapped a new rod in there. Not very technically, I didn't measure anything. So this time I measured the crank surface here, and it should be 1.5 inches. It was 1.493, so it was 7 thousandths under the allowed spec. So I mailed it out to a fella who turned this down to 10 under, so now it's 1.49, and the thing is beautiful. So I had to buy a new rod that's a 10 under rod. So at this point what I'm going to do is start to put this new governor cross shaft in, the new governor gear. After that we'll put the camshaft back in. After that we'll put in the crank, and that's about it. This is the new governor gear, which goes inside this crankcase. Let's see if we can show where. Way up on the top. See that wiggling piece? It goes way up there. So there's a little stub shaft up there that it pops onto. That's where I got to get it. Okay, so you see up there, that's how the governor cross shaft works. What happens is this governor gear will go up in here, and when the speed increases, that thing pops in and out right here, and that will cause the cross shaft to move like this, which will in turn turn the linkage, which this goes on to pivot the carb. Okay, so the governor gear's in, the shaft is there. Forgot there's a screw right here you got to take out before you can pop in the gear. So now the gear's in there on the shaft. The next step is to put the camshaft back up there, which will now mesh with that governor gear. Okay, I'm ready to put the cam back in. On these old Kohlers, the way the cam works is there's a rod like this, which actually goes through the block from the outside. You hammer it in, and it goes right through the center of this cam. You got to put this spacer here back in this side of the block, and I got to mesh this up with my governor gear. I cleaned everything really nice. I don't have a parts washer. I cleaned everything with brake cleaner and wiped it down, blew it off with the air compressor and everything. Make sure there's no grit in there from when I honed the cylinder or just crap from sitting around. Okay, now I'm ready to put the crankshaft in. And the important part about this is the timing mark. You see that mark right there? That's the timing mark. That tooth has to line up with the timing mark on the camshaft. Put the crank in. We put it right through the front of the motor here, through this bearing plate hole. Plug it all the way into that bearing over there. And that's about it. Okay, I've got the crankshaft installed, all timed up and everything. Now at this point, this bearing plate goes on to the other side of the engine, which holds it in for good. So in here, where my hand is where the bearing goes. That mounts on the crank. That just screws on the front of the motor here. I forgot to mention everything's getting all new gaskets, so put this timing gear cover on. Nice new gasket, cleaned up all the old grime around there, scraped off the old gasket real nice. So the bearing plate is over the crank. Got a new oil seal in there. At this point, you can see it's not tight. I've got to tighten these 4 bolts here that hold it on. Then after that I can put the stator back on. Okay, I've got my rod in here. I got to torque the bolts. Make sure that when you put your rod in that this oil hole right here is facing the camshaft. That's very important. And I've got my piston and rings gapped, obviously.